Okay. Welcome everyone to, okay. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's happening here. Give me a second here. Hold on one second. Welcome everyone to, okay. I don't know what's okay. Okay.
If this is lit up, you know you didn't close it. Even if maybe for whatever reason
Okay.
you didn't close it.
Okay. Take two. Welcome everyone to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. We are in the first book of Kings, chapter 9. I want to mention something to the people who are watching and to all the people who will be watching later in the week, that lately we've been like, if we get through one whole chapter for a class, we're doing good. We've been really delving deeply into the details, a lot of background information, a lot of commentaries. But I've decided, for many reasons, that we're going to start going a little bit faster now. In other words, trying to do a couple of chapters per class, which means just not delving into the details as much as picking out certain areas that we want to explore. And that way, we will be able to get through the first book of Kings and the second book of Kings, but at a little quicker pace. So we are starting in chapter 9, and hopefully we are going to finish in a certain way the story of Shlomo Melech this evening. Next week, I want to explore something that we will not get to here, that's not mentioned in the text whatsoever, and that is many traditions that were handed down. It's written up in the Talmud of Shlomo Melech's relationship with the world of demons. This is a whole fascinating subject. It does not appear in the written text. It's all oral tradition. And that we will only get to next week, but hopefully we're going to finish the story of Shlomo Melech tonight. So we start in chapter 9. And here it says that after Shlomo finished building the temple, that God appeared to him for a second time. And it says specifically, he appeared to him for the second time. There won't be a third time. This is really the two times. And the first one was when he was just made king. And it was in a dream. God came to him in a dream and said, ask of me whatever you want. And if you remember, Shlomo asked for wisdom to be able to judge the people of Israel properly. And God gave him not only that, but as the text has said a number of times, there was never anyone as wise as Shlomo Melech. Of course, it was a gift from God. So here God appears to him a second time, and in short, just says, as long as you keep the mitzvot, you keep the Torah, you stay connected to me, then this house will be a house as you desire it to be. And the kingdom of David that's coming through you will last forever. In other words, encouraging him that this is all you have to do. It was really very similar to the first one, where God said, this is the stipulation for your success. And so that is in the beginning of chapter 9. What's interesting is from verse 7 to 10, it's almost the same language as appears in the book of Deuteronomy, especially in the Parsha of Nitzavim. It's quite interesting that here, not only is God encouraging him, but he's also warning him. And this is a theme that's repeated throughout the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, many times. If you keep the mitzvot and you cling to Hashem, everything will be good on the physical level and the spiritual level. But if you turn away from God, then you're inviting disaster. And in the book of Devarim, the descriptions of disaster are quite explicit. And so here also, God says that if you don't follow the Torah, you don't follow the commandments, I will cast you away from this house, and the people of Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the people. And the land will become so desolate that people will ask, what has Israel done to deserve such a thing, that this city, Yerushalayim, which was in a certain way, the capital of the world at the time of Shlomo, what did they do that it's desolate now? So I'm just pointing out, it's almost the same language as the book of Devarim. So anyone can look this up, especially the Parsha of Nitzavim. We continue where it goes back into the relationship between Hiram, who is the king of Lebanon, and Shlomo. We've already discussed that Hiram, he provided the cedar wood for the temple, for Shlomo's house. Shlomo paid him very, very well, and mentions exactly how much he gave him every year in payment. And they had this mutual, call it business relationship. And here again, it mentions that at one point Egypt came and destroyed the city of Gezer. Gezer it's a little bit in the desert, and the king of Egypt conquered it from there were still Canaanites living there, and he gave it to Shlomo as a gift for his daughter, who Shlomo had married. We've mentioned a number of times that the daughter of the Pharaoh gets mentioned a number of times. And so here it says that Shlomo built, and it's mentioned now a number of places that, again, we don't know the exact places, but one of them, yes, is Megiddo. Megiddo, there are extensive archaeological dig there, and they've established it. It goes back to Shlomo Melech. It was one of the centers for Shlomo Melech. He built centers all over the country, and he had his horses and chariots and soldiers. We mentioned already that even though in his day he didn't have to fight any wars for 40 years, there was peace here. But part of the reason was that Shlomo Melech was prepared, very prepared for war, with horses and chariots and soldiers, with call it army bases all over Israel, and the surrounding peoples knew that, and so it was a deterrent. It's a big word in modern politics and warfare, is having a proper deterrent to avoid having to fight. If your enemies are scared enough of you, they will leave you alone. It's only when they don't feel that you're prepared that wars happen. And then it says that of the people in the land, this goes back to the book of Yoshua, where we mentioned that Yoshua never totally conquered the land. And there were pockets of the 7 Canaanite nations still in the land. We just saw that the king of Mitzrayim, he attacked one of the Canaanite strongholds in Gezer. There's a place in Israel today called Gezer. There's a place called Megiddo. And another place that he had storage houses is in Hatzor, which is up in the Upper Galil. And there also, they have extensive archaeological ruins that go back to Shlomo Melech. So this substantiates what is written here. And that's basically chapter 9. Chapter 10 is one of the most famous chapters in the book of Kings as relate to Shlomo Melech. And that is when the Queen of Sheba comes to Yerushalayim to test Shlomo Melech. She had heard that he was, both fabulously wealthy and he was incredibly wise. And so chapter 10, in a good part, at least the beginning, is about her journey to Jerusalem to meet Shlomo Melech. Now, in the text, she's called the Queen of Sheba, and almost all of the commentaries or the translations say that she was from Ethiopia. The kings of Ethiopia, there are no more kings. The last one was Haile Selassie. He was the last king. And his title was this long, long, long title. But in it was the idea that he was from King Solomon. In other words, the kingship in Ethiopia goes all the way back to Shlomo Melech. Now, in the text, it does not say that Shlomo Melech and Bathsheba had a child. But the oral tradition, there are different traditions, but many of them say that he had either she had one or two children from Shlomo Melech. And then she returned to her land. And in Ethiopia, they have a very firm tradition that the kings for literally 3,000 years were from King Solomon. Now, when I was doing my preparation, I found something that I had never seen before, is that not everyone agrees that she was from Ethiopia. There's actually another opinion that she was from India, which obviously there's a big difference between Ethiopia and India. But there are traditions that she was actually from India. And here it describes how she came, it says, to prove him with riddles. She had heard he was so wise. And when she came, so the text says that when she heard his wisdom and she saw the temple that he had built, and she saw the feasts, we had learned this already. Every day there was a huge feast at Shlomo Melech's home, which was enormous. And it was like the seat of government. The seat of government was not on the Temple Mount. The Sanhedrin was on the Temple Mount. That was the judiciary. But they call it the governmental operations was happening from Shlomo's home. And he had all of these ministers and servants and people in all of these different ministries. It was a very well-organized kingdom. And so I can't remember the numbers right now, but there were like thousands of animals that were slaughtered on a daily level to feed everyone. When she saw this, and it said that her spirit left her. She was like so in awe of the kingdom of Shlomo, but mostly his wisdom. She said to him, like, if I wouldn't see it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. But everything that I heard is true. And she gave Shlomo all these blessings and enormous amounts of gold and precious stones. And here it mentions also that when all of the different wise people from all the nations in the world would come, they would all come with gifts. And so Shlomo became wealthier and wealthier, not him personally. It was really the kingdom became wealthier and wealthier. And it said that Shlomo gave to the Queen of Sheba everything that she desired. Whatever she asked, he would answer her. So it could be that this was a hint when it says that he gave to her everything he desired. It's most likely alluding to the fact that she was attracted to him, and they were together, and they had children. But she went back to Ethiopia or India, And one of the opinions, as amazing as it is, that from one of the children comes Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the temple. Now, it obviously can't be him himself because the temple stood for 410 years. But it means that somehow one of these two children that she had led to Nebuchadnezzar, who was in Babylonia. So that perhaps is part of the understanding that she wasn't from Ethiopia, she was from India. Nonetheless, like many other things in Jewish tradition, there are different opinions based on different texts or traditions. So we will most likely never know exactly where she was from. And then in the middle of chapter 10 is a description of Shlomo's throne. Even in the simple text, it sounds pretty incredible. But the Midrash makes it even more fantastic. But even in the simple text, and it says there was no throne like this, it had never been made before. There was no such a thing. And here it explains it was made out of ivory, which was a very, even today, it's a very rare substance is to have a lot of ivory. But he made it in ivory and he covered it in pure gold. It had two armrests on both sides of him so he could put his arms. And on either side of the armrests, there were, one second, there were two lions on either one on each side or two on each side. And there were 6 stairs to get to the throne. And on each stair, there were 12 lions. And it's not totally clear whether there's 6 on each side or 12 on each side. It appears that there were 6 on each side, meaning 12 for each stair, because one of the traditions was, other than the lions by his armrests, there were 72 lions altogether. These were lions that were made out of ivory and covered in gold. And it says that there was no such a throne anywhere. And apparently on the top, it was a half circle behind him. There was a half circle. So when he was sitting before this half circle, also made out of ivory and then covered with gold. And it doesn't mention this in the text, but in the oral tradition, it had some kind of mechanism that when Shlomo would walk to his throne, a lion on either side of the stairs would stretch out his paw, and Shlomo would step really not even on the stairs, but on the paws of the lions. And apparently, also, again, this was not mentioned in the text, but the oral tradition was there were also eagles along with the lions on both sides of the stairs. And they also would stretch out their wings for Shlomo to ascend his throne. And in the oral tradition, it sounds like some kind of mechanism, a machine that actually did this, which is possible. It's possible. When we know that from the enormous stones just in the kotel, that to this day it's like a wonder how they lifted these enormous stones that were scores of tons each one to the higher levels of the what we call the kotel, which is just a retaining wall of the Temple Mount. So like I said, there were all kinds of stories about this throne. And you can imagine people coming to hear his wisdom, and they see this kind of a throne. People were obviously more than impressed. And then it says all of Shlomo's drinking vessels were made out of gold and silver. And then it says, very interesting, that he also he had ships that, and it mentions the name Eilat by the Red Sea. And apparently these boats were sent to different places in order to bring back, especially gold. In those days, even today, gold was a very, very important commodity, but also for spices. Here it mentions that as part of these ships going out, they brought back gold and silver, ivory, and apes. Apparently there were apes brought back, I don't know, for show in his kingdom. And it said that Shlomo's wealth and wisdom exceeded anything that anyone had seen. It mentions this over and over again to get it firmly established that this was kind of like a once in a history kind of kingdom that Shlomo built here. Now we go on to chapter 11. And here is something that everyone has heard about Shlomo Melech. And it begins by saying that Shlomo Melech loved many foreign women. And it names them from the daughter of Paro to Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Zidonite, Hittite women. And it mentions all of these were women that the Torah tells us that you should not be marrying. And so the question is, what is Shlomo Melech doing here? We've touched on this already. What is he doing here? And it even mentions that the text itself is bringing up like kind of what is Shlomo Melech doing? The Torah forbids this. And it says, why? In the Torah, it's in Parshat Shoftim, in the book of Devarim, book of Deuteronomy, the laws of a king. And it says two things about it. Well, it says a number of things about a king, but the two things it mentions that a king should not do is multiply horses, return the people to Egypt, and to have too many wives. These are the three things that it warns a king against doing. So the question is, Shlomo had tens of thousands of horses and chariots. He marries the daughter of Egypt, of Pharaoh. He marries all of these other women. And then it says that Shlomo attached himself to these women in love. So we had talked about maybe like even till today, that for the few kings that are left in the world, but of course, hundreds of years ago, many countries were ruled by kings, that a lot of the marriages, excuse me, were prearranged based on political considerations. That different countries like intermarried in order to strengthen alliances. That's just how it was done. So we entertained the idea, why did Shlomo marry so many women? And then it says immediately, it says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And then it says, and his wives turned his heart away from serving God. So let's go back. So we already discussed this actually, but I'm just going to review that the commentaries make clear that Shlomo converted all of these women. That was part of his vision. But it appears even from the text that these conversions were questionable. But it's important to state, when it states he married all of these foreign women, it doesn't say that he converted them. But the oral tradition is that he converted all of these women, but he not only was lax in were these conversions real conversions, and how these women were acting. The text makes very clear that they virtually all continued their idol worship, and that Shlomo allowed it to happen. But the vision here is, so Shlomo, one of the commentaries says, so what is Shlomo's rationale here? Because in the Torah and Shoftim, it says that you shouldn't multiply horses and marry a lot of women because it will turn your heart away from serving God. So Shlomo said, I can do this because it won't turn my heart away. So in other words, since the rationale was you can't do these things because it's going to turn your heart away, so Shlomo said he had the confidence that, well, since that's the rationale, and I don't fall under this rationale because it's not going to turn my heart away, then I can do it. But the text makes very clear that he was incorrect about his own assessment of his character, his personality, his abilities to deal with 700 women and 300 concubines. So, and it says specifically that he clung to these women in love. The actual words in Hebrew is that he was davak Shlomo la'ahava. He clung to these women in love, meaning most likely that he had relations with all of these women. Now, I'm not going to get into this extensively, but it's an obvious question. How many times could he have relationships with them? He has 1,000 wives here. So we're not going to make a calculation, but the year only has 365 days. I'll just leave it to everyone's imagination what the reality was here. It's not clear what the reality was. It's not clear at all what the reality was. Anyways, the text does say right after, when it names 700 wives, 300 concubines, and he says, and his wives turned away his heart. And that it says when Shlomo became old, here we're starting to get towards the end of his life. We'll see shortly that he ruled for 40 years, and the years of him building the temple, building his house, building the kingdom, amassing all of this wealth, people coming from all over the world for his wisdom, took up most of the 40 years that he ruled. So here it says that when Shlomo became old, we're on chapter 11, the 4th verse, that his wives turned his heart to other gods, and his heart was not perfect with God, as his father David was. And it said that he went after these different gods and goddesses, and his heart was not with God. Now, the commentaries say we should not understand this, that Shlomo actually worshipped other gods. But what the sages did say is that Shlomo allowed all of these women to have their statues and burn their incense and worship all these other gods. So in other words, there was all of this idol worship happening all over the place. And Shlomo, however we understand it, turned a blind eye. He didn't recognize the dangers here. But the text itself says that he worshiped other gods. So here, just in context, this is not the only time where the text makes it out like a certain thing happened. And the sages come and say it didn't happen literally like that. We understand it in a different way. One of the first ones is with Reuven. Actually, the Torah portion of this week, Vayetze, is when the tribes are born. Yaakov marries Leah and Rachel, or Rachel and Leah, and there are two maidservants, Zilpah and Bilhah, and he has all of these children. The first one is Reuven, and after his mother died, Leah, so it says that Reuven slept with the maidservant of Yaakov. And the sages, and later Yaakov, in a certain way, took away the Bechor, the firstborn privileges from Reuven because of this. But the sages said, don't understand that he literally slept with the maidservant of Yaakov. It means that he switched the beds, meaning that after Leah passed away, that he took up residence with Bilhah, which was his wife through Rachel. And Reuven felt that was an insult to his mother. And so he switched his beds. He took his bed out and he put it into Leah's tent. And so this is different than the literal text. We came upon this the same thing with David and Bathsheba, where according to the literal text, David had relations with Bathsheba when she was still married. The sages come and the whole thing that we discussed many times is that technically she was divorced at the time. Any soldier going to war would give his wife a bill of divorcement, a get, on condition that if he doesn't come back retroactively, she is considered divorced. But here again, you have another example of the text says one thing, and the sages say, no, we don't understand it like that. It's very subtle, and it's, put it this way, it's open for discussion, because it's clear that God considered David to have sinned. the question is, what exactly was the sin? We went over all this. I'm not going to go back over this again. I'm just mentioning it because here, if you read the text, it makes it as if Shlomo is worshiping idols. He turns away from the Torah, he turns away from God, and he's worshiping idols. And again, the rabbis, the sages say, no, that's not how we understand it. It just means that he was lax. But here we see God comes. One second. So God then declares. So apparently this is the third time God comes back to Shlomo and tells him, I am taking the kingdom away from you. You did not uphold your part of the bargain. You turned away from me. You turned away from the mitzvot. I am taking away the kingdom from you. And he said that, but for David's sake, for your father's sake, who I truly loved, I will leave you with one tribe, and I will not do it in your lifetime. But this is I'm doing for David, because God had already promised David that, excuse me, the kingship would go through David all the ways to Mashiach. And so here he's saying, I won't take away the whole kingdom from you, but you'll only be left with one tribe. And that tribe was, of course, his tribe, Yehuda, and the one tribe was Binyamin. And as we're going to see shortly, the kingdom was split in half. And Shlomo lost the kingdom, but not in his lifetime. So God comes and tells him this. And then, after 40 years, this is the end of Shlomo's life, all of a sudden, enemies started to rise up against Israel again. Because again, Shlomo did not keep his part of the bargain. God said, you will be protected. Israel will be protected. It will be all good and wonderful. You just have to follow the Torah and the mitzvot and cling to God. So here it mentions some of the enemies that started to rise up. And then, we're still in chapter 11. It mentions that there was a person called Yerovam, the son of Nevat, and he was a very, very strong soldier. He was young. He caught Shlomo's attention. Now, he was an outstanding personality, but he was young. And Shlomo appointed him the ruler over all of the labor of the house of Yosef. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. And he became, they had different governmental appointees, and he rose very quickly in the ranks. And then what happens is a critical event in Jewish history. We're still in chapter 11, verse 29. So Yerovam is now working, as it were, for Shlomo Melech. And this is the first time that Achia HaShiloni is mentioned. Achia HaShiloni is one of the most important prophets in Jewish history. He doesn't have a whole book named after him, and he didn't receive prophecies from God like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but he was one of the most important prophets. He was the teacher of Elijah the prophet. So already we have a sense of who this person is. We should know that a good part of the rest of the book of Kings 1 and Kings 2 are about the life of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, and his student Elisha. But their student was Achia Hashiloni. Now, according to tradition, he became one of the most important, call it links in the chain of Jewish tradition. Because, again, however we understand this, he is considered to have come out of Egypt. He was a student of Moshe Rabbeinu, even though he's not mentioned before this. This is the first time he's mentioned. But the tradition is that he was very old at this point, and he had a direct tradition from Moshe. And he becomes the teacher of Eliyahu Hanavi. And even more important, it's said that he was the spiritual teacher of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He wasn't alive at that point, but he was like a heavenly mentor for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and maybe even more important, and those who were part of the series that we did on the Baal Shem Tov, you will remember that when the Baal Shem Tov was 26 years old, on his birthday, Achia Hashiloni appeared to him and became his heavenly teacher for 10 years. So the soul of Achia Hashiloni throughout history, it's a little bit like Elijah the prophet kind of story, that his soul appears over and over in Jewish history, not necessarily in a physical form, but in a spiritual form, and became the teacher of two of the most important people in our tradition, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the Baal Shem Tov. So I'm telling you all of this because right here, Yeruvam went out of Yerushalayim, and Achia Shiloni found him in the field. And it says that he was wearing a new garment. Now, the commentaries ask, who was wearing the garment? Achia Shiloni or Yeruvam? It's not clear. We have a similar case, for those who remember, back in Shmuel Aleph, that when the kingdom was taken away from Shaul, and Shmuel Hanavi had to be the one to tell him that God is taking the kingdom away from you. Shaul was begging him in a certain way, let me make amends for not following God's word. And Shmuel said, it's too late. God has taken the kingdom away from you. And then it says that he turned to leave, and Shmuel, he turned to leave, and he stretched out his hand on his garment, and it ripped. And there also, the way it's written in the Hebrew, it's not clear who was taking leave and who tried to hold on to the garment of the other one. It's just not clear. So the same thing here. There, whether it was Shaul who tried to grab Shmuel and say, please don't leave, or it was Shaul that was turning away and Shmuel grabbed his garment and ripped it. And Shmuel said, this is a sign that God is ripping the kingdom away from you. Here it says that one of them was wearing a new garment, and Achia Shiloni took the garment, whether it was his garment or Yeruvam, and he cut it into 12 pieces, and he gave Yeruvam 10 pieces, and says, God has appointed you to become king of 10 of the tribes. 2 of the tribes will stay with, well, here Shlomo is going to, Shlomo is still alive here, but God had already told Shlomo and obviously informed Achia Shiloni to do this. In other words, Achia Shiloni was doing this by direction of God. And so he gives him 10 pieces and he says, you are destined to become king of Israel, actually called Israel. And when the 10 tribes split, they were called the kingdom of Israel. And the southern kingdom was called the kingdom of Yehuda. And so here, this is obviously a very, very important incident in Jewish history. This was the splitting of the kingdoms, and that splitting in a certain way, the reverberations is still present today. It is in different forms, but the form is a lack of total unity among the Jewish people. Whether you want to make the division between secular and religious, between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, between Jews who live in Israel and Jews who live outside of Israel. And then even in the religious world, there's a huge split between what's called the national religious public and the Haredi public. So the reverberations of this split that happened because Shlomo did not follow through, and he was not full-hearted as David was. David made many mistakes, but his heart was always with God, and his actions were always with God. He made a few mistakes along the way. But here it makes clear that Shlomo in his last years turned away from God. It just says he wasn't wholehearted with God like David, his father, had been. At the end of chapter 11, Shlomo Melech passes away. And it mentions that he ruled for 40 years, exactly the same amount as David. It doesn't mention how old he was when he passed away, but tradition is very clear that he became king at age 12. He ruled for 40 years. He was 52 years old when he passed away, which in those days was relatively young. We could attribute it to the fact that he turned away from God. It says that he was buried in the city of David, where David was buried. What's interesting is whether it's the real gravesite of David HaMelech or not, but there is a place on Mount Zion that is attributed to the burial place of David HaMelech. And it could be that that is the authentic burial place, but there's a lot of question. But everyone agrees that if he wasn't buried exactly there, he's buried very close. But we don't know where Shlomo is buried. There is no tradition pointing out where Shlomo was buried, but it remember, the city of David in those days was relatively small compared to what we call Jerusalem today. It was actually almost miniature compared to Jerusalem today. So we know more or less where Shlomo was buried. So this would be a good place to stop, because this ends the life of Shlomo. The next chapter begins with also this, it describes the split of the kingdom. And I don't want to rush through that, but that's what we're going to pick up next week. And also, we will begin the class, hopefully, with a insight into something, as I said, it's not mentioned in the text whatsoever. But in the Talmud, there's a full page discussing Shlomo HaMelech's escapades with the world of demons. And it's a very, very strong tradition that when it says that Shlomo, remember we said that Shlomo talked about the trees and the animals, but the deeper understanding is he talked with the trees and with the animals. So it's alluding to the fact that Shlomo knew the language of creation. But along with that comes these traditions that he also not only knew the language, but he ruled over the kingdom of demons. But we're going to see that he was playing a very dangerous game here. And hopefully I'll whet your appetite to come next week to find out these pretty way out stories and what we can learn from them. I'm hoping also to give over Rav Ginsburg's insight into these stories about Shlomo HaMelech.